Hello everyone and welcome to this explainer. Today let's discuss about slowly changing dimensions. One of the most important aspect in data modeling. Imagine you are working as a data engineer in a retail company and you are building a data warehouse. The data warehouse contains multiple tables. One such table is customers table, which contains information about customer like their name, their age, their phone, their email, their address, their location, and so on. Now consider this scenario where a customer moves from one location to another. For example, John moves from New York to Chicago. So as a data engineer, I have one question for you. Should your warehouse update the address of John to Chicago, or should it also keep the historical record that John once lived in New York? Well, such kind of real world problems lead us to the concept of slowly changing dimensions. To solve such problems, we need to understand what is the difference between a fact table and a dimension table. What kind of dimension data are we dealing with? Should we keep the historical record or only the latest record? What SCD strategy best fits the business case? Well, to answer all these questions, let's understand what is an SCD or a slowly changing dimension. So, what is a slowly changing dimension? A slowly changing dimension is a dimension table that changes slowly over a period of time, unlike the transaction data which changes frequently. There are multiple SCD types. The first is SCD type 0. This is the fixed data. It does not change over a period of time. For example, date of birth. The next is SCD type 1. Here you can overwrite the data, but you do not need to keep the historical record. So the next is SCD type 2. Here you add new records, but you also track the history of the past records. The next is SCD type 3. The SCD type 3 maintains limited history. So you add a new record, but you also keep the historical record in the same table in a separate column. So a very natural question arises: when to use which SCD type? Well, it depends on the business case. For data that does not require history tracking, you can use SCD type 1. For data that requires historical tracking, you use SCD type 2. And for data where you require both the previous state and the latest state, you use SCD type 3. So, in our retail business case, which SCD type is required? Well, the answer lies in the business requirement. So, if there is a business requirement that a regional sales report is required, then it is important for us to know which region did John live when he purchased an item. So, the answer is very clear. We require to track the history. In this case, SCD type 2 is the right approach. So let's see this in practice. We use pandas for working with tabular data. We also use the date time to get today's date. In this code, we simulated John's record in a data frame. So in the data frame, you can see John's current city is New York. The start date is January 1st, 2020, which means this record became effective on that date. The end date is set to null and the isCurrent flag is set to true. This shows that the record is still active. Now let's suppose we receive a new data showing John has moved to Chicago. Since John has changed the city, we don't overwrite the old record. Instead, we create a new record while closing the old one. So we will update the old record. For this, we locate John's customer ID and we set the end date to today's date. We also change the is current flag to false, which will mark this record as no longer current. This means now the table says John lived in New York from 2020 until today. Now let's insert new record that says the city of John is Chicago. We set the start date to today's date and we set the end date as none. We also change the is current flag to true. This means for the upcoming purchases made by John, the records will have the city as Chicago. Now we will use the concate method to append the new record to our existing table. We set the ignore index true to renumber the index after adding the row. Let's now print the table. So we see two records that help us know John lived in New York until today, and from today onwards he is in Chicago. Okay, let's now look into some of the best practices to keep in mind. Here are some tips. First, decide upfront with the stakeholders whether a data requires historical tracking or not. Second, use or maintain separate surrogate key and business key. Third, use effective date and current flag to easily query between historical data and the current record. Fourth, avoid unnecessary use of SCD Type 2. This will blot your dimensional table. So, what are some common errors that usually occur in such scenarios? Sometimes we forget to close out the old records. Also, the late arrival data are not handled properly. Sometimes developers misuse SCD Type 1 when the actual requirement is to use SCD Type 2. So, to wrap up, slowly changing dimensions handles evolving attributes in data warehouse. It is important to understand which SCD type should we use depending on whether history is important or not. In our case, SCD Type 2 allowed us to keep a track where the customers lived when they made the purchase. This is how data engineers ensures accurate reporting and analysis. So if you found this useful, subscribe for more real-world data engineering explainers with code and business use cases.